Chapter 13, Kale M. At 5:30 one January morning, Peter Atherton and Joe Jankowitz left Newburyport in the Kale M and headed for the mouth of the Merrimack River. From there, they would go 6 miles offshore to drag for shrimp. The temperature was about 10 degrees. Though in the summertime, Peter Atherton used the Kale M to chum for tuna, it was not a sleek or fast boat. It was stubby, deep and buoyant, built for pulling long cables attached to heavy nets, built to support the gallows frame and the net winder at the stern, built for working with and cleaning fish on deck in a heavy roll. We cruised upriver at 8 knots. "Off like a herd of turtles," Peter said. "Off like a prom dress." Peter was built like his boat, low to the ground and solid. He had straight red blonde hair, reddish eyebrows, the bluest of eyes, and experience written on his face, which was weather-burned and deeply lined around the eyes. I'd last seen Peter at Tri-Coastal Seafood one afternoon in August. 2 fish were brought in that day, the first by a member of Tri-Coastal's board of directors, a fisherman who owned a dockside business in the off-season and fished avidly for tuna in the summer. He'd been doing well and had caught about 15 fish at that point of the season. When he got the price that day, $12 a pound, he left in a huff. After getting similar prices from other buyers in Newburyport, he loaded his fish on a pickup truck, marched from his boat with clenched fists, and went to Gloucester, where he got $16, a victor for the day. The second fish was Peter Atherton's. He unloaded it, took a $12.50 price without question, walked along the dock saying hello and smiling to his friends, got his free ice, which the workers shoveled onto his boat, and left a happy man. Peter used only one buyer, and he thought it paid to do so, as it had that day, when his fish got 50 cents more per pound, or about $300. Peter had grown up around Newburyport, and he'd begun market fishing for striped bass when he was 10. He dug seaworms for money, and later, after serving in Vietnam, he worked on various commercial boats, putting in an apprenticeship with a tuna fisherman. He got a boat of his own and tried gill netting for a while, then abandoned it after draggers twice ran through his gear, a $25,000 loss each time. The Kale M had been built 4 years before, the year after Peter got married. Normally, in the winter, he dragged for cod, but they hadn't yet arrived in Ipswich Bay, where he worked, so he was trying shrimping. In the springtime, he caught cod and flounders. In the fall, he caught cod, flounders, and lobsters. Summers, he switched over to tuna. Ground fishing was a consistent fishery, Peter said. If you got 100 pounds an hour towing and you put in 10 hours a day, that was 1,000 pounds of fish. The average price was 90 cents per pound, so a day's work could amount to $900. But it wasn't always that neat. Some days amounted to more, others to less. Peter got out ground fishing about 150 days a year, and his average gross income was approximately $150,000 in 1995. 10,000 of it went for fuel, nearly 40,000 for help. Up to a third of that, $150,000, came from bluefin tuna, depending on the success of the season. In 1992, Peter had caught 6 fish and averaged $15 a pound, for a total of $43,000. A decade earlier, back when bluefin were going for $3 a pound, He had made a name for himself by catching a tuna every day for 28 days, using herring on the first baiting and squid on the second. He'd been running a skiff then, and when he hooked a fish, he just let it pull him around until it tired. Tuna fishing was like playing the lottery. There was always a chance you would catch a fish worth $40,000, so why not try it? He tried it about 60 days a year. Tuna fishing wasn't merely a sport to him, it was an important part of his livelihood, a crucial segment in the rhythm of his season. And with the National Marine Fisheries Service's new measures to protect ground fish stocks, closures of areas, increased net mesh sizes, and limits on the number of days at sea, Peter Atherton and other draggers would depend more and more on the bluefin tuna fishery. It was warm inside the cabin as he moved out from shore, and the sky began to lighten. There was the ever-present aroma of fish oil, too. On the shelf in front of the windshield was a bank of electronic instruments, which enabled Peter Atherton to chart his course and find fish with the precision of a whale or dolphin. The irony was that these instruments had helped to bring about the depletion of New England cod and haddock stocks, and they were a reason why certain men, families, boats, and whole communities were now threatened with failure. Among Peter's electronic tools, the most impressive was a scanner that allowed him to see underwater far away from the boat. A 15-degree swath 900 feet out and 200 feet wide. On the surface, he could do the same thing at 360 degrees with his radar set. He had Lauren, a network of radio beams that allowed the fishermen to know precisely where he was located. He had several radios, a video sounder that showed the water column and the bottom condition, and a video course plotter into which Peter could program the tows he ran and the places to be avoided. Green dots on the plotter screen represented wrecks, rocks, and hard bottom. Among the green dots floated a blinking yellow dot, the Karen Ann. Peter navigated among the hazards as if he were playing a video game. If things got tight, he could phase in for a close-up. At 6:30, they made their first set, and the net rolled out from behind the boat. The season for northern shrimp, Pandalus borealis, had begun in mid-December and would run until the end of April. The shrimp were migrating inshore to lay eggs now. Peter thought they came in on the westerly winds, moving against them somehow, then went out again on the easterlies and the tides. Millions and millions of them finding some olfactory cue in the force of the water. To give the shrimp a break, no fishing was allowed on Sundays. The NMFS also required a Nordmore grate, or finfish exploder. Shrimp and small fish passed through the gate and deeper into the net, but anything wider than an inch or so went flying up through the roof in a jet stream of water. The shrimp fishery was another relatively small but important segment in the yearly scheme of certain draggermen. Annual landings in the Gulf of Maine had declined from 11,400 metric tons in the late 1960s to 400 tons in the late 1970s, then increased to 5,000 metric tons by 1987. In 1992, landings were 3,400 tons, and the 1993 catch was forecast at 2,100 metric tons. 2/3 of the landings were by Maine boats, 15% by boats in Massachusetts. The number of vessels in the fishery was 300 to 400 yearly. The average daily catch was 750 pounds, and the shrimp were worth about $1 a pound. Peter expected to get about 400 pounds on this day. He stood in his cabin, watching the course plotter and the boat, moved along at slightly less than 3 knots, with the sound of a slow hum, the deep growl of an engine at work. Joe watched the morning news on the TV set at the end of the bank of electronic gear. A dragger resembles a large mechanical fishing pole. A boat, a long line, a bag at the end. The reel was on the gallows frame at the stern, and onto the spool wound 2 cables 750 feet long. The reel was powered by hydraulic winches placed at the fulcrum of the boat. The net system was called an otter trawl. Set out and doing its work, this net resembled a big fishnet stocking. The net rode along the bottom and was held open by chains at the bottom and floats on the top. The sides were pulled apart by 2 hydrofoils, doors, that flew outward. The steel doors were heavy and ran along the ground, creating a mud cloud that herded fish in front of the net. Moving along at 2.5 knots, the cod and haddock and flounders grew tired and drifted back, collecting in the bag, or cod end. Unlike finfish, shrimp didn't react to the mud cloud, but just fell into the trawl as it plowed by. At 8:30, Joe sprayed the deck with seawater to wash away the ice, and they began to haul in. The cables wound and snapped around the spool. The doors rose from the water and were fastened to the stern. Up came the floats and the chains and the first parts of the net, all winding onto the spool. Gulls swooped in to pick at the trailings. Then the bag, round and bristling, swung over the deck and hung suspended until Peter hit the hasp and the catch spilled into a pen. The net was swung back, the hasp fastened, and out it trailed from the stern. Peter worked the winches while Joe, in oilskins, wearing gloves, crouched and picked among the pile, sweeping the shrimp to one side and tossing the cull overboard. The small mackerel, herrings and flounders, the sea robins and the stray starfish, scallop or octopus, all to the screeching of diving gulls. He ran seawater through the catch, then shoveled the shrimp into bushel baskets. He filled 7 of them. Thus his first haul amounted to a catch of 350 pounds. It was one of the best tows of the season. Peter was back at the course plotter, working a northerly curve along the 40-fathom line. Rockport and the lighthouses of Thatcher's Island were off to the south. Seabrook, New Hampshire, was ahead on the horizon. One of the things Peter liked about being a fisherman was that he could see his accomplishments at the end of the day. He could have been working in a factory, putting in this part or making this widget, and at the end of 8 hours he'd punch the clock and never see what he'd done. But with fishing, you put something on the dock. Good or bad, at least you could see the results of your efforts. He had tried other things. When he turned 40, just after he got married, Peter began to think he was too old to be splashing around in the water. So he quit for a while and got a job at the Boston Globe, distributing newspapers to the carriers. He quickly saw that there was no future in it, but he did have some time to think and decided to build the Karen Ann. After he got back in the water, there were some great runs. For 3 weeks, working within sight of his house on Plum Island, Peter had caught 1,800 pounds a day. His family sat out on beach chairs watching him. With money from the run, he bought the scanner. Now in all, He had about $120,000 invested in boat and equipment, though it wasn't the kind of investment that made money on its own. You had to go out and use it to make it work. Peter was having a new boat built, a Maine lobster boat of classic lines, a design he'd long admired, and he hoped his sons would work on it someday. But he was using inherited money to do it. He didn't intend to invest in any new equipment for a while, not until after the new groundfish regulations came out. The problem with some people is that they don't know how to manage their money, Peter said. They have a good day and they go out and get drunk and then don't go out for a couple of days. Or they go out and buy a truck rather than put some away for when times are bad. This brought up the subject of alcohol and drugs. Cocaine had ravaged some fishermen in the 1980s. It was especially attractive to fishermen who took 4 to 5 day trips and worked watches around the clock. 4 hours of sleep followed by 8 hours of work. Cocaine nearly eliminated the need for those 4 hours of sleep periods, but the problem was in keeping the nose packed. They would come to shore, unload the catch, 40,000 pounds of pollock sometimes, visit their dealer, run a few errands, and then head back out to sea with a supply worth several $1,000s. Some of them spent $500 or more a day to keep the buzz going. But those days were over for the most part. Some of those men were out of fishing, some had died, others were clean. There was a group of fishermen in Newburyport who neither drank nor did any drugs. Joe Jankowitz was among them. I'm glad I didn't get into that, Peter said. There was all that available in Vietnam, but I decided not to do it. I wanted to come back. I wanted to stay alive. I thank God that Vietnam gave me that. 2 hours after the first haul, they brought the nets in again, and another 300 pounds of shrimp spilled into the pen. Joe culled the catch, then settled into his bunk to watch TV. This was the part of the day when he watched The Price is Right. He put on sunglasses so he could doze off more comfortably. Outside the window next to his bunk were blue sky and rolling ocean. TV is important out here, Peter said. This fishery takes patience. All these boats have TVs on them. There was a rotary antenna mounted on the gallows frame, operated by remote control, and it was necessary to adjust the antenna to correspond with the tack of the boat. Joe did that now, got the best picture he could, and then settled back. All up and down the Gulf of Maine, I assumed other fishermen were doing the same. Peter talked about his son, Adam. He was 13 and doing well in football. Peter didn't fish on Sundays during football season so he could go to the games. Adam had scored 11 touchdowns this season and rushed for 1,000 yards. Peter's first wife had died when Adam was 2. Adam's birth had followed 4 miscarriages. Peter's second wife, Karen Ann, was Joe Jankowitz's cousin, and Joe had introduced them. Her husband had also died. The two dated, they had something in common, and soon they got married. Peter brought Adam to the marriage, and Karen brought a boy and girl. Now they had a baby daughter. In Vietnam, Peter had been wounded by a mortar blast. In the hospital, after he'd recovered a bit, they asked him to feed some of the men in the next ward, the guys with serious injuries. Seeing them, Peter decided that he wouldn't try to get medical compensation for his wound, that there were guys who needed it more. After he got out of the hospital, he was cleared to go back to the field. He asked for a deferment. There was shrapnel in his neck, but the doctor threw up his hands. Then a sergeant came along and asked Peter if he could swing a hammer, and after Peter built a hooch, he was hired as a bartender. There were others attached to this sergeant, and when the commanding officer came in and ordered everyone back to the field, it was time for Peter to ship out. He left Southeast Asia on his 21st birthday. Because of time zone changes, it was his 21st birthday all the way back to Boston. The hard part was when he got back to Newburyport. People kept saying, "Where the hell you been?" They didn't care about what he'd been through, that he'd had to wear the same clothes in the jungle for 40 days until they were falling apart from the heat and the sweat. He was still messed up from all that, just like everybody else who went over there. But there was an advantage, one of relativity. All those things that have happened to me over the years, the marital problems, the gear problems, fishing, all those things, when I think about them, I just think about Vietnam and I say, this is nothing. Joe was dozing. Family Feud was on. While talking, Peter had lost track of his course plotter. The yellow blinking light was very close to an ominous green dot. He spun the wheel. There was a change in sound, a lowering of pitch from the engine, and a vibration from the gallows frame and cables. "Time to haul in, Joe." Joe roused from his bunk. "Sorry," I said, for the distraction. Peter pulled on his boots. "That's all right," he answered. "Shit happens." The third haul brought another 250 pounds. The sun was at its strongest, there was a little wind, the sky was clear, and it actually seemed warm while Joe called the trash fish, even though the temperature was in the low 30s. Joe washed the deck, and Peter sat at the chair by the wheel and watched. "What Joe is doing isn't hard work," Peter said. "You've just got to be out here. You've got to put the time in." Joe did watch a lot of television, but he also spent a good part of the day on his knees, in the cold, pulling herring and other cull from the net. He had also grown up in Newburyport and had made a business of catching striped bass in high school, and he'd been part of a crew of boys on a tuna boat owned by two brothers who ran a taxi company and used one of the taxis to transport fish. He'd worked on draggers and longliners, and for the fabled harpooner Herb Randall, who once hit 74 shots in a row. Joe owned a slender 34-foot Jonesport, one of the last wooden boats built by Vinyl and Osmond Beale of Beale's Island, Maine. In 1990, ranging from down East Maine to east of Chatham, he had caught 51 bluefin and was given an award as the best tuna fisherman in Newburyport. Dragging provided steady work and a saving income, and Joe liked doing it, but it wasn't his true line of fishing. To relieve the drudgery, he took vacations in the winter. He'd be going sword fishing in the Gulf of Mexico soon. When Joe went to Florida one winter to play golf, Peter brought his sons out to work for Christmas money. They had been out during the summer before, but the boys didn't like fishing in the winter very much. It was blowing hard that day, and they spent a lot of time at the back of the boat, getting sick. Even so, they split what would have been Joe's share and took home $250 each, which made them feel a lot better about the experience. Maybe they would take up fishing later on, but as Peter said, they might not get as much out of it as I do. Peter gave Joe a good share, but much better than he'd give someone else for fishing with him in the winter. Joe was dependable, so Peter didn't have to hunt around for other men. If someone without experience or with a hangover slipped and got hurt, there could be a lawsuit. He had insurance, but it probably wouldn't be enough. He'd lose his house, maybe. Sometimes when Joe took time off, Peter fished alone. He had an automatic pilot and could clean the fish while the boat ran on its own. Of course, working alone could be dangerous. 2 years ago, another fisherman, someone who was on the bay this very day, Peter added, had gotten caught up in the net and was wound around the spool. The trailing part of the net got caught in the propeller, and that stalled the engine. By chance, another fisherman was looking around with binoculars, saw it happen, and came over to help. Ideally, there should be 2 men aboard a dragger. But one time, out here working alone, I got into some flounders and some big cod. I made $1,100 in one tow and got to keep it all to myself. The last haul began at 4:30. Up came the cables, snapping with the tension. Up came the doors, the floats, the mouth of the net, and the bag. Joe hit the hasp, and another 225 pounds of shrimp lay on the deck. The total haul that day had been 1,175 pounds. Not a bad day, Peter said, as Joe stowed the baskets in the hold. He turned for shore and called Karen on the radio. He told her he'd be in at 7 or so. He'd eat, talk to his wife, talk to the kids, and within an hour or so he'd fall asleep. At the end of the day, you've had enough, Peter said. You're ready to head in. Then the next morning, you can't wait to get out here again. And so we headed in. The sky was dusty brown, with a band of yellow, green, and then blue. A quarter moon grew large and red and set over Newburyport. The clock tower glowed above the buildings and cast a long reflection on the Merrimack. The Karen made its way up the river to try coastal seafood, where Bob Campbell was waiting, and together they unloaded the $1,175 worth of shrimp, the day's work.